I call the honourable member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to address this issue, the motion regarding Genesis. This, of course, comes out of the government's failed privatisation program. And I think it's important for us to remember how the privatisation program worked. The first step was tax cuts for the very wealthy, which have cost probably in the order of $5 billion, probably more so far, just the cost of tax cuts for the top 10%. The government gave very large amounts of money to the top 10% and then said, oh, there's a hole in our budget. We don't have enough money, we're going to have to sell assets to cover the hole in our budget caused by the tax cuts. And so then they said, we're going to have to sell some of these assets, and they sold about $5 billion worth of assets. And of course, who could afford to buy the assets? Well, it wasn't ordinary mums and dads. They couldn't afford to buy shares in Meridian Energy, Genesis and all the rest. They don't have spare cash. Of course, the people who could afford to buy the assets were the very same people that Bill English and the others gave tax cuts to. $5 billion was transferred from the Crown account to the wealthiest 10% in the country, and then $5 billion was paid back to the Crown account to purchase the shares in these assets. So at the end of it, for ordinary people, what they find is that their collective assets have been reduced by about half. Half of these assets were sold. And of course, for the very wealthy who got Bill English's very large and generous tax cuts that didn't go to anyone else, the very wealthy found themselves in possession of half of the nation's electricity generating assets. It was straight theft. The National Party orchestrated the straight theft in front of everybody's eyes of half of the electricity generating assets in the country and moved them from the ownership of all New Zealanders and gave them to the very wealthiest people. And of course to the wealthiest corporations, because many of the shares in these assets simply went to large corporations or they went offshore. So it was simply a straight theft, stealing assets in front of everybody. Everybody could see that the National Party was transferring the assets. Hence, it was not at all surprising that the overwhelming majority of New Zealanders opposed the theft of their assets by the National Party, and we saw that in the referendum and in every opinion poll. And so, nonetheless, the National Party proceeded to steal the assets from the people of New Zealand. And then they have the temerity during this election campaign to offer the money back, some of the money that they raised in the slush fund, as election bribes. So they sold, this is John Key as the slush fund manager. So he's the manager of the slush fund created by the asset sales program. They sold the people's assets against the people's will. Overwhelmingly, people were opposed to the sale of these assets. Then, after selling the assets, they offer the money that they gained, they offer that money back as an election bribe. So that they say to people in rural New Zealand, we'll pick a number of our favourite roading projects across the country, and if you vote for us, we'll build those roading projects with the money that we got from stealing your assets. So it's like someone breaks into your house and against your will steals some of your stuff and then sells it and then says, here, have some money back, you should like me, because here's some money from me. Actually, it was New Zealanders' money. It was New Zealanders' assets that the National Party flogged off, and now they're using the cash that they got from selling the assets as an election bribe. It is disgraceful behaviour. Bill English talked about how we should value all the dollars that ordinary people pay in the form of taxes. I agree with Bill English. My question for him is then, why did he waste $748 million on the process of the asset sales? And I think it is important for people to realise how empty the rhetoric is of this government about being fiscally conservative. This is how they spent the money. Treasury spent $85 million on the asset sale process itself. They spent $12.6 million just on those ads on TV. You know, the ads you saw on TV that were shown to ordinary New Zealanders and said, buy shares in these companies, companies that you used to own, that people used to own, buy shares in these companies. Those ads cost $12.6 million. On top of that, Treasury outsourced to contractors $65 million worth of work. That is, taxpayers had to pay $65 million to these contractors. They were things like people who were doing PR work in order to try to massage public opinion. They were people like stockbrokers who were taking a cut out of the process of the asset sale process. And then Treasury spent $8 million internally on the asset sale process. So Bill English, who tells us that it's so important that we look after taxpayers' money, spent $85 million just in Treasury on the asset sale process. The companies themselves spent $36 million preparing themselves for privatisation. So the companies on top of that spent another $36 million. And then we had the incentives. Now, the incentives were the bonus shares, whereby the National Party said to its mates, if you buy a share in this company and you hold on to it for a certain period of time, then we will give you extra shares for free. Now, of course, they're not for free. They're paid for by taxpayers. The bonus shares for Mighty River Power cost taxpayers about $25 million. The Meridian incentive cost taxpayers about $33 million. And the Genesis bonus cost taxpayers about $22 million. So this is all the money that Mr English told us he's so careful with spending. He doesn't like to spend it on things that are not important. This is all money that Mr English and the National Party has given away as part of this privatisation process. And then we have the losses on the sale. Now, if you compare the book value of these companies versus what the National Party actually brought in when they privatised the assets, there's a difference there of about $361 million. Now, they sold the assets for $361 million less than they themselves valued them at. So effectively they lost $361 million of taxpayer value. On top of that, they gave Rio Tinto $30 million as part of the sweetener. Remember, Rio Tinto had the government over a barrel because if they didn't renew the contract for Meridian, well, they threatened the contract with Meridian, then it would decrease the value of Meridian, but particularly all the other assets, including Genesis. So Rio Tinto, a hugely profitable company, was able to force the government to hand over $30 million as part of the process for the asset sales. So when you add all that up, including $9 million on the referendum, whereby the people of New Zealand spoke very clearly that they did not want the asset sales process, then Bill English, who tells us he cares so much about taxpayers' money, wasted $748 million on a process that the overwhelming majority of New Zealanders opposed. This is a government that prides itself on fiscal rectitude, and they are spewing money everywhere in order to force through this incredibly unpopular privatisation process to transfer ownership of these companies from all of us, from all New Zealanders, to a tiny few. That, I think, demonstrates the true priorities of this government. And it's to create for themselves the slush fund. And so John Key, the slush fund manager, is managing a slush fund of this $5 billion, and he hands it out here and there where he thinks it's important to get votes in the election campaign as he manages the slush fund. A big part of the slush fund is guaranteed to go to increase water pollution in the form of the $400 million irrigation fund, because the National Party are determined to increase toxic pollution in our rivers and lakes across the country and are giving $400 million free to the irrigation companies. That's money that ordinary New Zealanders used to have. This is part of the government's pollution economy. So instead of having an economic and fiscal strategy which was sustainable, they have a different kind of strategy, and that is asset sales are a key part of it. Borrowing, of course, is a key part of it. This government borrowed $50 billion. The government that supposedly knows about money, well, what it really knows about is borrowing lots of money. It's very good at borrowing money. It's excellent at borrowing money. And it's very good at asset sales. It forced through the asset sales program. But, of course, borrowing and asset sales doesn't generate any new wealth. When we look at the parts of the economy that they're very interested in, it is simple commodities, milk powder, raw logs, the kinds of things that don't make a country rich. That is the focus for the government's economic strategy, their pollution economy. When you look at what they're spending on research and development, it's tiny, 1.3% of GDP on research and development, a tiny fraction. And the projections going forward, a 20% cut in research and development under this government's own projections in the 10 years forward. So instead of having a smart green economy which invests in innovation, research and development, this is a government that has a pollution economy that pays its bills by selling assets and borrowing money. That is the truth around this government's economic strategy. Now, we have put up a number of alternatives to this government's failed pollution economy, but of course it's only a change of government that will bring them into life. So, for example, the NZ Power proposal put up by the Greens and Labor for a single buyer to create competition in generation and retail. Currently, vertical integration of the generator and retail companies mean that there is no real competition in the electricity sector. If you want real competition in generation and retail, that's what NZ Power will achieve, because it puts a horizontal dividing line across the electricity market. There will be real competition and hence innovation in the electricity market under NZ Power, whereas the current system, there's none. Then there's our solar homes project to make sure that people can access solar PV panels on their roof to give them some control over their power. A smart green economy that invests in innovation, research and development is a much better option than the pollution economy and asset sale economy that the National Party is proposing.
I call the honourable member Andrew Williams.
Thank you very much.